All right, welcome to Lecture 2. I'm going to do a hop. There we go. Lecture 2 for EDD Module 939. Module 6 of EDD 939. Sorry, I totally messed up the module. But this is Lecture 2, and we are talking about decisive acting under the broad heading of strategic acting. And so last lecture talked a little bit about the mindset for strategic acting and how it connects to strategic thinking. So let's really dig into this idea of decisive acting here. Again, hopefully you have the slide deck in front of you. And so you've had me, I think most of you have had me in class now. You know I always like to set terms and parameters. I like definitions. I like to say this is what we're talking about, what it's not and what it is. So that's what we're going to do here in these first couple of slides. So what is not considered decisive acting? And I mean, I guess to a certain extent, any decision we make and take an action, we could call it decisive acting, right? But you know what we're talking about here, kind of those big, more important, I guess you could say, decisions. So what is not considered decisive acting in our roles within organizations? One of them would be those normal day-to-day operational decisions that we make. That is not what we're talking about when we're talking about decisive acting. And that goes back to what I was discussing right at the end of the last lecture as far as how we can get paralyzed and recognize, we need to recognize not every decision is of strategic importance, but we can get paralyzed there if we're not careful. So normal day-to-day operational decisions are not what we're talking about with decisive acting. I thought, none of us in the morning as normal functioning adults walk outside of our house in the morning and throw our chest out and our cape on, so to speak, and say, all right, I made decisions about what to eat and what to wear as I go to work today, right? Those aren't decisive actions. Now, for a 5-year-old, if they start picking out their own clothes, we applaud them. But for those of us who are adults, that's just normal. So those are not decisive actions. Actions that are of low strategic impact. In decisions that have a low impact on the long term are not strategic or are not decisive actions. Now again, remember, strategic acting can have impact. We can have short term, but you know what I mean. I mean, some decisions have very low impact on long term ideas. I would tend to say an action that has a great deal of information is not decisive acting. And what I mean by that is, because last lecture I talked about we feel the need to have a lot of information, but and I'm trying to think of how to clarify, because I'm going to also talk about this in the next slide. It doesn't mean that every decisive action only has limited information, but typically the more information we have, the better we can weigh out all of the options. And so a lot of times it's just recognizing a decisive action doesn't have a lot of information. Now, I might. That one's a little bit arguable, that point. But typically a great deal of action is not considered decisive action. And then the impact on others is limited in scope. And so what I mean is it may be a decision that only affects a very small group. Rather than a really large group. Now, don't get me wrong. You can have a decisive action that has a significant impact for a small group of people too, teams or something like that. But typically, a decisive action is going to have a bigger ripple effect. So, I thought of an illustration of this that I hope might be helpful to you to talk about with what would not be a decisive action. So this this academic year actually that we're still in, we implemented a new curriculum for the EDD program. And we added 2 courses to the EDD program: quantitative research methods and qualitative research methods. Now, I would say this: the decision to change the curriculum was decisive action. That's strategic action. However, what happened was, as I was laying out the courses for the year, so this is about a year ago, my original intent was that quantitative research methods would be offered in the fall and qualitative research methods would be offered in the spring. And you may note, if you've taken those courses, quantitative is 908 and qualitative is 909. So I even kind of numbered them sequentially. Now, why did I have that laid out that way? No particular reason, other than maybe because in my doctoral program, I took quantitative before qualitative, just because that was the way it worked for me. So in my mind, quant will be first and qual will be second. So as I was working on that, that was the original, in my mind, what was going to happen. But as I talked to the 2 professors who teach those courses, Dr. Axement, who teaches quantitative, and Dr. Langemeyer, who teaches qualitative, as we were discussing this, what I found out was fall is a much heavier semester for Dr. Axement with the other courses that he teaches, and spring is a much heavier semester for Dr. Langemeyer and the courses she teaches. So as I'm talking to both of them, I said, well, wait a minute. Would it help both of you if we just swapped the order? And both of them are like, oh, that would help immensely. Okay. So we switched orders. So here's what I'm saying. That was not a decisive action. That doesn't fall under strategic acting. Why? Because the impact was minimal. And there was no strategic significance to it, because where I had placed them originally, there was no significance to it. We needed to plunk them in somewhere within that first year. And it didn't really matter which one came first. And the impact was minimal, because what order you take them has no real impact on students either. So that's an example that I would give you as far as a decision I needed to make as a director, but I didn't really agonize over it. I had just originally plunked them down, and then as I started talking with them, found out actually it's better if we switch them. So there was really no thought given to it. It was just, do you want to switch? Sure. Done. Those are the kind of things that I'm saying are not decisive actions. So what is a decisive action, or what is decisive acting? Well, I would say that they're decisions, making a decision that's in an out-of-the-norm situation. So something that's not the normal day-to-day operations of your department or organization or program or whatever. It's a decision that does have significant strategic impact. Significant strategic impact. And a decision that has significant long-term impact. And then it's a decision that in which we often have limited information. Again, as I was stumbling through in the first slide trying to say, that's not always the case. There can be cases where it is decisive acting and we have a great deal of information and we still have to move forward. But often it's limited in these situations. And then typically the impact is fairly large in scope. So there's going to be an impact on a greater number and or greater diversity of people. So again, back to my illustration of the quantitative and qualitative courses, the only 2 people really that were impacted by that decision were the 2 professors. I realize you could say, well, students are impacted. Not really, because you're going to take those courses no matter what, right? It didn't matter when they were offered, so it really doesn't have an impact on you. the impact was on the two professors, and in that case, it was a helpful one. So that's what I mean. Whereas decisive actions are usually bigger in impact. So, and I apologize, my allergies are acting up a little bit. Springtime. So the example I would give for this one, as far as what is a decisive action, would be the response that we've seen this last academic year when I'm recording this lecture, this last spring semester, to COVID-19. Decisions made around that were very much decisive actions because that was an out-of-the-norm situation. And I would say, when we even started second semester, no one was anticipating it. We didn't think that within a few weeks into second semester we'd be switching everything online. It definitely had significant strategic impact, significant long-term impact, absolutely, on faculty members, on students, potentially on the way we deliver education as a whole, and so on and so forth. Did we have limited information? You bet we did. How long is this going to last? Should we not, and schools agonized over that, and very large in scope. So that's an example where we very much had to make decisive decisions and take decisive actions. And I think, my opinion is some people should be doing this, and I think they will write up analyses and case studies of how organizations adapted and changed and reacted to the pandemic, because it was a situation that none of us had experienced before, that none of us knew how to react to. And some made early decisions, some waited longer, some put in buffers. We're going to, do this for 2 weeks. Like my own kids' school, not college here, but their school, what they did is they said, and a lot of schools did this, they announced over the weekend, we're going to take the next week off and see what happens. And we will make a decision within the next week as far as, as we monitor. And then it became, well, we're going to do this for a time, and then this. And finally, I don't think it was until, end of March, 1st of April, we'd been in this about 3 weeks, where they said, okay, school. And a lot of that came from the State Department of Education. But and other places were early to say, we're shut down the rest of the year, and so on and so forth. So it's a great example of decisive acting because it fit all of these criteria. So uncertainty, that's the next slide there. Uncertainty, recognize that this is a key factor in strategic decisions. This idea of uncertainty is a key factor when we're making strategic decisions. And I kind of talked about that, like I said in the last lecture, about highlighting the fact that there is always an element of uncertainty. And especially as strategic leaders as a whole, but as strategic leaders, wherever we are in the organization, we need to learn to be comfortable with a certain level of uncertainty. It's funny, a certain level of uncertainty. Anyway, my wife and I talked about this during all of the COVID-19 things, and I said I don't envy the college presidents and executives and principals and superintendents and I was just thinking from an educational context, let alone the business leaders and things like that. I mean, it's hard enough, and I've been in this situation not as a principal but as a leader of other organizations. When it's a snow day, right? I mean, I've agonized over that decision. Should we cancel this event because of the weather? That's a hard enough decision to make, and that's like one day or an evening activity, let alone a whole semester, a rest of the semester. What do we do? So there's a certain level of uncertainty no matter what, and it's a key factor as we make strategic decisions. And there's nothing we can do about that other than learn to accept that and as much as possible get comfortable with the uncertainty, if I can put it that way. And as the book points out, recognize there are different kinds of uncertainty. There's, as they say, there's even, you pull out, pulling out a card from the suit of spades, there's a certain level of probability, right? So there's uncertainty there, but that's a lower level of uncertainty than pulling out a particular card from the suit of spades. And so, just as the example, there's different levels of uncertainty. And then you could move even beyond that as far as with the decisions we have to make. What's the probability that we're going to do this or this or this? So there's varying levels of uncertainty. And strategic acting comes in, or when strategic acting comes in is when there's true uncertainty. That's when it's really strategic acting. Because otherwise it's just managing the probabilities. When there's true uncertainty. So for instance, here's some questions I wrote down that we're facing right now that reflect where strategic acting comes in. What will higher education look like in the next 5 to 20 years? What will higher education look like in the next 5 to 20 years? So then, what should we be investing in now? And that's a whole lot of uncertainty, even more so with what's gone on the last few months. Also connected with where many of you are. What will healthcare look like in the next 5 to 20 years? And so where should we be investing now? And that also ties into where many of you all live as far as working in healthcare colleges. So there's two factors. What's higher ed look like? What's healthcare look like? And what are the impacts of healthcare and what higher ed looks like? How do we put those? So, there's even more uncertainty that goes on. And so, it's accepting that and it's recognizing that. And that's where true strategic acting comes in, not being paralyzed by that uncertainty. And then the final thing for this lecture that I want to discuss is, as the book talks about, there's 4 contexts for decisive acting. 4 contexts for decisive acting. Simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And I would, a simple context and complicated. I would put it this way. I think Ronald Reagan is the one who said this. Many solutions are simple, but they're not necessarily easy. And I would say that probably characterizes both your simple and your complicated contexts. The solutions are simple, but they're not necessarily easy. And I know you say, well, can a solution be simple if it's complicated? Excuse me. Well, simple from the standpoint of, again, a car engine is complicated, but I can learn how to fix it, right? With enough study and messing with it and everything else. So it is complicated, but it's simple to learn how to fix an engine from the standpoint of it's doable. Now, it's not easy. It's going to require a lot of study and a lot of messing and things like that. Or I go back to an illustration I use a lot. Losing weight. Losing weight, it's pretty simple. If you come to me and say, I want to lose 30 pounds, I can tell you pretty easily or simply how to do that, right? And I think we all know that. The problem with many of us who want to lose weight and we don't, or get into shape and we don't, is not that the solution is hard or is complex or is complicated. It's hard. And that's what Reagan was indicating. Solutions are simple. They're not necessarily easy, right? It's not easy to lose weight. It's not easy to drop those pounds. It's not easy to get into shape. It requires a lot of hard work, but it's simple. As opposed to these other situations, these other contexts. complex situations. Solutions are not simple or easy. And I think the book is the one. I'm reading a lot of books right now for the different classes as well as other stuff. So I think, though, it was in your book where they make the illustration, a rainforest is complex. A Ferrari is complicated. A rainforest is complex because it's a living, breathing ecosystem, and it's changing all the time. And this is in my leadership class. I make the point, and when I talk about leadership, why is leadership so hard? Because we're dealing with people, and people are complex, and we're messy, and so it's and we're always changing and adapting, and so that's that idea. And so strategic acting, recognizing a lot of times, comes in those complex situations. This whole COVID-19 situation has been a complex situation. Complicated too at times, but complex. And then it also has been, that last one, chaotic. Chaotic situations are usually require a faster decision. And I want to drive home this point about this before I close this lecture. With chaotic, what we need to be cautious about there is quick fixes becoming long-term solutions that actually then in the long term cause more problems than help. The quick illustration I would give you about this in closing is from world history, and it's Julius Caesar. Rome was ruled primarily by, they had the Senate, and then they had this triumvirate, kind of three equal rulers and sharing power. Well, they had a crisis going on, so Julius Caesar sweeps in and says, hey, make me, the emperor and temporary leader with absolute power to fix this problem. He does, and then he says, you know what? I'm good, so I'm going to stay in this position. And then that led to the emperor role, and we see the problems with Rome. That's not how Rome was originally designed. And of course, they assassinated Julius Caesar, hoping that would take care of it. It didn't. But that's an example where the quick fix in a chaotic situation, then it became their long-term solution, but it wasn't necessarily a good one. And often the quick fixes in a chaotic situation don't make the best long-term solutions. And companies have done this. They come in and they're in free fall. And so they slash prices or slash budgets and make radical decisions to stop the bleeding, and they have to, right? But they can't keep that in place. You might identify with this, and then I'll be done. But I remember when I took my first aid class, and we were talking how to stop blood flow things, and one of the people asked and said, we've all seen on TVs, and they said, so should we use a tourniquet? And I remember our first aid instructor saying, only if it is absolutely necessary do you use a tourniquet. He said, like, literally life and death, because he said, as soon as you put that tourniquet on, you need to consider, and he may have been a little hyperbole, but he said, as soon as you put that tourniquet on, you need to consider everything below that tourniquet is dead, is gone, is amputated. And it's a quick fix in a chaotic situation, but it will have long-term impact. And so you have to consider that. And so those are those contexts for decisive acting. So in the next lecture 3, we'll turn and look at the concept of agility.